deepest depths of Stirling University lies a man who ponders important questions. Not questions like, what's the meaning of life, or why are we here? But questions that center over one concept. How do I scare my audience? Tonight, he will answer that question, reading tales that are so utterly horrifying they may leave you weak at the knees. Welcome to the Spook Zone.
Ladies, gentlemen, other eldritch abominations, I welcome you to the 24-hour version of the Spook Zone. I'm doing this. It's midnight. I'm primed. I'm ready to get into the horror mood. I've got an actual audience this time, which is a bit frightening, but hey ho, doesn't matter. As long as I don't consistently stumble with my words, I should be all right. So. If you're familiar with the show, you usually are expecting me to read stuff from Lovecraft. But today, I think I'm going to do something a little bit different. Going to do a different horror author when it comes to the more gothic tales, stuff from perhaps the 19th and 20th centuries. We're going to be focusing on Edgar Allan Poe, who is one of the most well-known horror writers, not only of his time, but also of the general horror world. He has an especially good way of articulating and creating this sense of gothic dread, this sort of unpleasantness and sort of uncanny elements that really make horror stories so interesting to listen to, and Edgar Allan Poe is great at this. So, to this end, I'm going to be reading to you one of my favourite stories of his. It is a tale about a man and his cat, and how he has been essentially witnessing especially strange and odd things that the cat has been acting. And he decides to investigate this, and it gets a little bit strange, to put it lightly. This is The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. One second, just see if the actual sound is working. Yeah, there we go. It's a little bit quiet, but that's fine. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I'm about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not. And very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world plainly, succinctly, and without comment a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than Baroque. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect, more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these, I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of my character grew with my youth, and grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who would have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncognital with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point. And I mention the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when, by accident or through affection, they came my way. But my disease grew upon me. For what disease is like alcohol? And at length, even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of the haunts about town, I fancied the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when, in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and cut one of its eyes from the sockets. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was at best a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it was true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as one might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the divisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with tears streaming down my eyes and with the bitterest remorse in my heart, hung it because I knew that it would love me, and because I had felt it had given me no reason of offense, hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as if to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforth to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had there, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with a very minute and eager attention. The words strange, singular, and similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas-relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope around the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I had remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of the fire, this garden must have been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The failing of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact I just detailed, it did not less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months, I couldn't rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat, half stupefied, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogshead of gin rum which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of the hogshead for some minutes. And what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every aspect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white, covering nearly the entire region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it off the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favourite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame, and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it had also been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I've already said, possessed in high degree that humanity of feeling which had been once my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Wherever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws into my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, the absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss of how to otherwise define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark on the white hair of which I had spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and for which a very long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man, fashioned in the image of high God, so much of an insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest or any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates. The darkest and most evil of thoughts, the moodiness of my usual temper increased to a hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and unforgivable outbursts of a fury to which I am now blindly abandoned myself, my unaccompanied, complaining wife, alas, was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperating me into madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interface into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbours. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into multiple fragments and destroying them by fire. At another I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I consider far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by false chimney, or a fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over with the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up, and with the last minutest care, I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labour has not been in vain." The next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it, and at the moment there could have been no doubt in its fate, but It appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of a murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed. Still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man, but the monster, in terror, had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. The officers bade me accompany them through their search, and they left no nook nor corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee that my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to save but one word by way of triumph, to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind me, which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the archfiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream. Utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumphs, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts, it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered into the opposite wall. For one instant, the party upon the stairs remained motionless, though through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell, bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast, whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me into the hangman. I had walled up the monster within the tomb. Presto, story done. I totally do have time for a comment. Should I? Yeah. Ooh.
William, the last time, honestly, I heard Edgar Allan Poe was on the show The Following,
Mm-hmm.
which starred Kevin Bacon, which was about a murderer that was following the trails of Edgar Allan Poe's poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, that show was chilling to the bone, even when they read different parts of the poetry. As someone that has just had an hour to themselves of poetry, that was more chilling than anything that I have ever heard.
This
Nice.
is amazing.
Um,
I was so happy to sit here and listen to you keep going forever.
I know I've said it before, William. Honestly, it's one of the best non-music based shows on Air 3.
Thank you.
It's been continuing for a while now, and I was really upset to see that Spook Zone had moved from PM slot to an AM slot on a Friday.
It was just more convenient for me.
Honestly, I know it was convenient for you, and
Yeah.
honestly, hearing it at a PM slot again,
Yeah.
fucking chilling to the bone.
It does really nicely fit in with the sort of theme of the actual. I don't know what it is.
Honestly, I think you could do that in an AM slot, and I would sit there and think, I could sit here forever. Like, I could just listen to this story go on. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I was so jarred when Kieran had a comment go on. I was jarred because I was so involved in your story.
Well, the thing is, like, the horror writing is intrinsically this sort of thing that has to rely on drawing you in. So, and you can go on and say that I did a good job, but most of it's due to the fact that the writing is done in a way that compels you to constantly listen in.
I think it's the fact that your voice comes through so wonderfully.
Yes, I agree.
You don't do these weird little voices. You do the voices that suit each and every instance in the story. And I think that the fact that you're able to modulate in such a fact that I could not listen away. There were things going on outside. I don't care. I wanted to hear this.
I mean, like, Poe is my favourite author.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the Black Cat one.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I came in halfway through. But Poe is, like, my favourite author and always will be. And yes, a lot of it is down to the writing, but the way that it's read is also very important, and you read it really well.
It gives it a life that I feel like it needed.
A writer can write very, very well, but if the person reading it doesn't make it justice, then what point does everything have?
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly. Every writing is about interpretation. The fact that William is to give it such great interpretation, I think that gives it amazing justice.
Yeah, I've listened to you do Lovecraft on the 9am slot.
Yeah.
And honestly, to do justice to Lovecraft, because I've read Lovecraft as an English student.
Yeah.
Have not enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's
to hear it on 9am on a Friday on a morning that I have off, to get up early and that be the thing that I listen to.
Well, basically, you're amazing.
No, it's really
essentially
it's on a 9am slot. It's something to enjoy.
Yeah.
Lovecraft people. There's been, because somebody actually said when the schedule went out, Spook Zone, what is that about? And we commented, it's a late night slot where somebody reads Lovecraft and things that are considered macabre and horror, and somebody said, oh, that's brilliant. And then when it moved to a 9am slot, a lot of people that I know were like, oh, I don't know if it fits it. The people that I know that have listened to it and stuck with it, because I have friends that have listened to it that have actually went, honestly, Lovecraft in the morning, it's something different to wake up to.
Yeah, when I put myself for the 9am slot, I did have that thought of is this gonna work? But I think that there is something very sort of energizing about listening to a story that specifically tries to target parts of your brain that are inherently very difficult to grasp. Like, as much as Lovecraft has numerous and very, very easy to identify flaws, there is something very, very tangibly uncanny and ungraspable about his work that makes it something that immediately allows you to just go, oh, I'm awake now. Oh, God.
I mean, the fact that
God help me, I'm awake.
God help me, I'm awake. I don't know what to do with this information.
The fact that the adjective Lovecraftian exists shows how good and how influential Lovecraft writing is.
Yeah.
But William, I have a question.
Yes.
Lovecraft or Poe?
Oh, God.
Well, when it comes to... Well, they're different in what they write about, I think. Poe is very centered around man's failings, like, inherently. It centers around ideas of what's terrible about perhaps going crazy, like going and receding into primal desires. What's bad and what's horrifying of about not caring for others and becoming a monster in oneself. It focuses on human concepts which are very like graspable, but Lovecraft's horror is very different in the sense that it makes sure that when it's discussing things, it puts everything in a light that is just impossible and sublime and just frightening, not because we know what it is, but frightening because we don't know what it is. With Poe, we can identify these feelings, we can sympathize with these characters, but we're still, that's what makes us horrified. With Lovecraft, we can't, and that's what makes us horrified.
Yeah, they work both in their own like good way, and I mean, like, I think you're definitely right about what you say when it's Poe is about. I wrote my A-level like mini dissertation on Poe. I think the fact that Poe himself was such a troubled individual and basically descended into madness and depression and all that stuff. It's like you can read it in his work. Like you can see that the reason why his horror and why we so identify with how he talks about madness and things like that, it's because he was going through it himself. I mean,
can you see that in each work that he puts out? Like each consecutive work, you can see that he's going worse and worse into a depression or
you can see as it goes on. Like some of his earlier stuff is a lot less mad and has hints of optimism in it towards like romance and things
then
like that.
Disappears.
His very late stuff is very like it's all over the place. Some of it, and like it's a lot more depressed and like negative about life in general. So I definitely think you can see a descent through him. I mean, while Poe was alive, his work wasn't successful very much while he was alive. I mean, he got
a lot of great artists find that.
Yeah, he got money for The Raven when that was published in a newspaper, and he got money for a couple of other short stories, but the majority of his work was not popular.
Poe, he didn't make a lot of money in his life, did he?
No, he made barely any money and died.
Oh my God.
He died almost destitute and was found, I believe, with a high level of alcohol in his blood, just on a bench in a park.
From a man who is putting out this level of quality and then only getting the most minor of recognition.
Yeah. It was only until later that
I'm not so proud that I would say I'd probably do the exact same thing he did.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean also
drink myself to death.
His one true love died.
Well, yeah,
and like he wasn't. I believe he made an attempt at more mainstream writing.
And did it go well, or
because he thought, if people aren't going to buy my horror, then maybe they'll buy other things that I write. And he wrote some crime, and he wrote some like more mainstream thriller stuff at the time.
And how'd that go?
Massively unsuccessful. Nobody
Really?
liked it. So he kind of thought, well, if you don't like my horror and you don't like anything else I write, then what's the point? He's a very sad. It's a very sad story of how he was.
He is. He himself is a very sad character.
Yeah,
He's a very sympathetic guy.
Yes.
Lovecraft was more successful during
Lovecraft.
his life.
Well, I have mixed feelings about Lovecraft, both in his works and as a person. Definitely as a person.
Definitely as a person. Yeah.
I don't know anything about him as a
Lovecraft.
person.
The reason a lot of people stipulate that the reason that Lovecraft wrote so much and at great length about concepts of the ungraspable and the
indescribable,
was because of very distinct racist ideology.
I have heard about.
Yes.
My friends have read the great, the huge Lovecraftian stories.
Necronomicon.
That's what I use.
Thank you. The Necronomicon.
You'll get there, James.
It's a hard word.
Necronomicon? Necronomicon.
There you go.
There it is. I did it. I'm very proud of me. And they would tell me these stories of how he would just very, very, very casually slip into what I like to call ultra racism.
Yes.
And just talk about how the people who were of black, what's the word I'm looking for?
black people. Ethnicity. Thank you. People who are of the ethnicity of black, and they would in these stories, Lovecraft would paint them as, you know, the dangers, the monsters, the scary, to watch out for them.
Yeah, I mean, it was his whole idea of Lovecraft's big idea of the concept of fear of the other.
Yes, that's what it is.
And the thing out there. I mean, and he paints it as like Cthulhu and things like that. But the other is, to him and many other time, was the black people.
It sounds to me like he painted an idea of. I like to think this, and it's probably not true, but I like to think he painted a story of two parts. One where, in any time frame, he could be seen as making general horror stories about an otherworldly thing that was coming, that had nothing to do with any of them. But he also wanted to get across his ideas of, you know, what was happening at the time, the contextual problems that he had with the people who were, maybe segregation was coming to the end of the time. I just don't know what time period.
Well, but when it comes to Lovecraft, it's very much it's very much very subtly how he puts it in. He as Daniel says, he writes very jingoistic and othering sort of writing very casually, and it's
as if it's almost second nature to
yes, and I think that I think it reflects a mindset that wants to perhaps push ideas of segregation.
So do you think that he wants to push the boundaries rather than he's wanting to portray his own ideas themselves?
I think it's. I'm not sure. I like to think that, like when Lovecraft was writing these stories about the entirely unknown, that he wasn't always just thinking about other cultures and how he found them scary.
He didn't consider that, oh, black people are bad. Oh, that's
I like to think that in a lot of cases he didn't think that, but there is a lot.
There is a lot.
That, like, when it comes to there are a lot of horror stories in Lovecraft's library which center around like cults and of people of certain creatures, and a lot of the time Lovecraft describes them as coming from like interbreeding or weird, like really like concepts that we today would probably consider like terribly racist.
Oh, terribly racist, barbaric. I mean, this is the way the world tends to move.
Yeah.
We tend to see that the previous generations were intolerant.
Yes, and it's sometimes quite startlingly clear.
Yeah, it's certainly with Lovecraftian work.
But I think while it does have a multitude of problems, and especially when it comes to stuff like culture, the horror is still effective, and it's why I actually bother to read them in the first place. If Lovecraft was entirely just this racist figure that constantly talked at length about how bad, like, race mixing and all this sort of cult stuff that we see as like completely fine today as this terrible thing, then I wouldn't read it. But the
fact is, he writes it so well. It's not about the race mixing. He just writes general horror very well.
The horror,
and if you could switch out the racial connotations with, you know, general indescribable monsters.
It's an unfortunate,
and it would still be a chilling tale.
I wish that Lovecraft would just replace most of what he wrote with these horrifying eldritch abominations as opposed to real life things, because when Lovecraft writes about real life things, that's when his writing becomes the most just grim to read. But when he's talking about ideas of terrifying extraterrestrial stuff, and it's great. So that's why I read it. I often make disclaimers before I read certain things that you should listen for this and understand that what Lovecraft is writing right now isn't good. So keep in mind.
That just reminds me of, there was one time a very early Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoon went, and it was like, we do not agree with anything that, but to not show them is to almost ignore what they were. What the ideas were. So I think it's good that we keep on to read them as they were originally.
Ignoring the problem would...
It doesn't go away.
If I were to either not read, just flat out refused to read Lovecraftian stories, I wouldn't get and explore these ideas, these interesting ideas about horror that Lovecraft presents. But if I were to just completely, like, not say anything and just read it as is, like...
It'd be almost like you were not forgiving, but you were just kind of pretending it didn't happen.
I would be reading it as if it was common sense and it was fine. And that's exactly what Lovecraft wanted to convey, and that's
wrong.
That's the bad stuff.
Yes.
So...
Completely agree.
Okay, I think we've gone a little bit off topic, but generally, when it comes to comparing Poe and Lovecraft, I like Poe more as a human being, but...
Lovecraft, it chills me more. Poe, I really liked his sense of setting a scene, you know, I really liked how he made me feel like I was there, but when it came to Lovecraft, I was chilled every time.
I think I really like Poe's poetry. I'm not a huge fan of poetry in general. I think it's a bit useless.
Okay.
But
is writing. I mean, if we
I really like Poe's. I really like Poe's poetry. I think it works really well. It has a nice scheme to it. It's very lyrical in how it works. I mean, The Bells is really good. Obviously, The Raven, things like that. So, William, what's your favourite Poe story?
I gotta say that it's probably this one. I remember.
It's a good one.
I remember getting told to, like, well, I'm buds with a bunch of people who also write horror stories, and a while ago one of my friends requested that I give this a read and like give it, like, record it and help them with a sort of little project that they're doing. And I remember just having being left with such an interesting feeling of horror that I'd never felt before. Like, when it came to horror stories, oftentimes it centered around these monsters or things that weren't human that we had to wrestle with. But Poe was interesting to me because he made the main fear of the story the main character and what horrible debauched thing he's going to do next. And
because so often I find that the human character is the worst character. And
I love that. I found, and being in this is one of the things that really introduced me to Poe as a writer. So I really enjoyed it. I think this is one of my favorites personally. Of course, The Raven is definitely up there as well.
Naturally.
But this one just is
obviously things like The Telltale Heart and stuff like that.
This is what got me into it.
William, can I just say, after honestly listening to a lot of the things you said tonight, it's actually really interesting. I know I had to dip out a little bit.
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling's
Harry Potter is the word.
Yeah, no. the Tales of Beedle the Bard.
Yeah.
There was actually, when she was looking for inspiration for a lot of the tales that would feature in the books, because she'd wrote about the books as a whole before she'd written the individual stories that would eventually be released as a book. One of the things she looked at was Edgar Allan Poe, and it was how it became things with it was the Dirty Harry Heart. Was at times it was actually really interesting towards the Telltale Heart, and with many other things that Poe wrote. If you read the Deathly Hallows, you will actually see things that J.K. Rowling related, and even if you look actually through J.K. Rowling's mythos through like years and years and years, you'll see influences from Edgar Allan Poe as one of the major influences before people would actually start reading into it later on as being Edgar Allan Poe stuff. If you read into, because she started referencing some of the stories from the Tales of Beedle the Bard, well before they became significant in the books. I think it's really interesting to see, and I say this as somebody that's listened in tonight and listened in before, because usually it's Lovecraft and I don't relate too much to Lovecraft. I've seen certain things from Lovecraft that I relate to in modern media, but see tonight listening to you read Edgar Allan Poe. I've never read Edgar Allan Poe out loud. It is really interesting to hear out loud because when you say certain things with it, I imagine it almost in the wizard style of J.K. Rowling's universe, and honestly, that's a talent. I'm really happy I got to hear that tonight.
I love the fact that like Poe's influences felt everywhere. I mean, you mentioned The Following, which is phenomenal. James Purefoy as Joe Carroll, the serial killer, is phenomenal. So like that's fantastic.
That was how I got introduced. It shouldn't have been the way.
You see, as I was watching that, because I was a huge fan of Poe already, and I'd written stuff on him and things like that, I was spotting references before they came up in the show, like before they got mentioned by the characters in the show, kind of thing. And it was really clever how they worked that in. But I mean, we've talked about Poe and Lovecraft, and one of my favorite modern writers is Stephen King.
Yeah.
And he's openly said many times that the only reason he writes is because of Poe and Lovecraft, and if they didn't exist, then he wouldn't exist. So
There's something going off that I want to say, because you haven't said it tonight, and I think, honestly, I didn't know it until recently. You had some works published.
Yes, I as I was talking earlier about some writer friends of mine, but they and I essentially got together a group of things that we've written like basically since high school, and we managed to put them into a book, and they managed to put it on Amazon, and you can buy that and read some of our stuff. And
Give it a full plug.
I shall give it a full plug.
Give it a full plug. What is it called?
I need to actually.
How can I find it on Amazon? Because honestly, after listening tonight, I didn't hear the full thing. I heard the first 20 minutes. I heard the last 10 minutes, and I'm really sorry I missed the 10 minutes in between that. But honestly, from listening to Spook Zone every single week, I want to listen to more, and I feel like everybody that listens into Air 3 to Spook Zone needs to hear what you've been written.
Yeah. So the actual book is a thing called The Darkest of Dreams. It is a little horror anthology with myself and a group of other writer friends. We wrote some horror stories. It was a very enjoyable affair for everyone involved. Hopefully, if you are interested in horror and you want to see some like horror writers that aren't necessarily going to be as good as Poe or Lovecraft, but certainly trying to get into the horror writing field and perhaps do something a little bit new, check it out.
Is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon. It's on Kindle as well.
How do I find it?
What William is trying to say is, he's trying to say nicely that in the future, in 20 to 30 years' time, someone will be reading William's work on Air 3 Radio.
I swear, if somebody does
What
that.
about doing an audiobook?
Everywhere.
Regardless of whether or not
Read
it's
me,
good.
baby!
So,
Alright, Austin.
so William, just The Darkest of Dreams?
I think it's just Darkest of Dreams.
Darkest of Dreams.
main-
I know because I've got it on my my Apple. My Amazon account.
One of the like the.
Does it say by Christopher Warren?
Christopher Warren's one of the guys
you
who
go.
wrote it.
I just bought it.
On air, there's
Well,
the
there
biggest
you go.
head of production buys thing right away.
Aye.
What
So
are you gonna end us with?
I think, considering that this has been a very spooky show, I think I'm going to end with the eternally frightening Spooky Scary Skeletons by Andrew Gold.
Amazing.
It is a classic, and generally, it's a pleasant time. Hopefully, you guys enjoy this trek. It's a good time.
Ooh.